Hey folks, welcome back. So in this lesson, we're going to take a look a little bit deeper into how API Gateway works. So looking at our DevOps doctrine, let's click on how API Gateway works. And I think a good way to describe API Gateway is that it holds these APIs, which in a sense are a service contract. So you can subscribe to these APIs and you're guaranteed certain behaviors and levels of service from these APIs. When an app or a client gains programmatic access to AWS services or a website through one or more APIs, which are hosted on API Gateway, you're given methods to interact with your API. So as we discussed in the previous lesson, our app or our service is at the front end of the API. And the website or other AWS services, such as Lambda functions, and just think how many different things you could do with different Lambda functions, these are located at the back end. How does this interaction take place then? For an example we're going to look at momentarily, we are given HTTP GET and POST methods that can be used to interact with the back end through API Gateway. So let's go to the management console and go into API Gateway and let's click Get Started. Now we have no APIs, so what we are presented with is an opportunity to work with a sample API. And this sample API happens to be really good as far as just understanding what's going on with API Gateway. So let's go ahead and work with this. So AWS has pre-populated the input form with a pet store API defined using Swagger 2.0. And Swagger is an openware software package which helps developers design, build, document, and consume RESTful web services. So this is going to be a REST API. So let's just click OK. And we're going to have HTTP integration. We're going to use HTTP GET and POST to interact with our API. And again, we're working with the example API, and this is under the covers. I've said that the API is kind of like a black box. Well, we're getting a look into the black box, designating Swagger 2.0 sample API that integrates via HTTP with our demo pet store. So looking at our diagram, our pet store is back here. And of course, our API is up here, and we are over here wanting to interact. So a bunch of code in here. And unless we're actually developing the API ourselves, we don't even need to know what's going on here. It's good to know though. But as consumers of the APIs, we just need to know how to interact with our API. And this is certainly not a Swagger development course, so let's just trust AWS on this one. All right, so what we want to do is perform an import. We want to work with this API. All right, your first API is fully populated from the Pet Store Swagger template. You can now deploy your API to see it in action. All right, so we have a resource panel here. Its structure is a tree of nodes. Notice that, all right, /pets, we have get, options, post. Further down in the tree, pet ID. So basically we can get information on a specific pet if we provide a pet ID. So I'm going to go ahead and click on pets here. The methods available are presented. Likewise, let me click on pet ID. We should expect to see these two. There we go. And for each method, we have its endpoint URL. And the authorization required and API key. And as you can see, this is pretty open for us just to play around with. All right, so let's go a step further with this. So what's going on with this get? Well, let's click on it. And we could do that here or here. Method request, integration request, going over to our endpoint. integration response, method response, going from here through the API to the endpoint, back out. Let's check out our post. So these method requests and method response are the API's interaction with the front end, with the app or service on the front end. And naturally, as you would expect, integration request, integration response are the API's interaction with the back end, whether it's an EC2 endpoint, probably a website, or a Lambda function, or some other endpoint. No matter what, this communication is going on if we're executing this post. And when I say these APIs are like a contract, well, when you utilize this API, you're guaranteed this behavior, you're guaranteed these interactions. So for our app or service on the front end to communicate with the back end, we go through API Gateway using any of these methods. And if there's any translation necessary, the API Gateway is going to do that for us to communicate with the back end appropriately. So we send the request to API Gateway. API Gateway translates it. This translated request is sent to the back end. And it's just the reverse on the return trip. The back end sends a message, this integration response, to API Gateway. If translation is necessary, API Gateway does that and sends this method response back to the client. Now, if we're consumers of these APIs, we just need to know what's going on. We need to understand our contract. If we are developers of APIs, well, then we have some control over what's going on. We're developing this method request and method response. Likewise, remember, if we're developing the API, which is sitting in the middle here, we're responsible for defining and creating these back-end communications as well. All right, so that's a look at the inner workings of an API. And we can test this. So let's do that. Let's click on test. All right, so we're going to make a test call to our method with the provided input. All right, so remember, this is an HTTP post. We can provide query strings. We can provide headers for our HTTP header. But what we want to do, remember, a post, we're posting to our backend client, which in this case is a pet store website. And in the request body, let's paste in what we want to post. So type dog price $249.99. So basically we're inputting a price for purchasing a dog from the pet store. And let's click test. All right, so using the post method, we made a request to pets. Status 200, that's good. Time, response, success. We've successfully posted this to our backend website. Here's our response header. We have some logging going on, and we have an execution log for this. But bottom line is this was successful. Now let's just look at this log. Notice this transition. Here's our method request. Then we have endpoint request. Here's the pet store URL. So basically this is the integration request. Endpoint response. That's the integration response. Method response. That's from API Gateway back to the client. So that's a look at how this is all working. Let's say that we've tested our API and we feel good about it. What's next? Well, let's go to actions, and notice we have a bunch of actions here. But what we want to do is deploy our API. So let's click that. Now we can name these stages whatever we want to name them, but it's very similar to software stages. Deploy, build, test, staging, production. Those are the types of stages we're talking about here. Let's click on New Stage, and let's just call it Test. And just add a couple descriptions and deploy. And we are given an invoke URL. Well, let's just click on this. This is basically another way to access our API outside of API Gateway. And basically with this, we have just done a GET on our API. API talks to our endpoint, and this is the response we've gotten back. Let's go back to API Gateway, and notice here is our test stage. Let's expand that, and let's just show one more thing. I'll select GET on the pet's pet ID. All right, here's our invoke URL. Let's copy this. Let's go to a browser, enter that in. Now, we need to replace this pet ID. Let's just put a 1 in there, and let's send our request. There we go. And that, of course, is from our previous put. Let's go back to API Gateway. So in this lesson, we created a sample API for a pet store, tested it, and deployed it. And we just took a look at the inner workings of these APIs. And in this instance, this REST API is using HTTP GET and POST methods to facilitate this interaction from front end through API Gateway to back end and sending the response just the way it came. And with that, we have completed this lesson. Please join me in the next lesson.